Somewhere beneath a canopy that has been growing continuously for roughly 140 million years, longer than flowering plants have even existed in most of the rest of the world, an island split between 3 different countries is quietly becoming the site of one of the largest capital city construction projects on Earth. Bulldozers are carving roads through rainforest older than the Amazon, older than the dinosaurs' final days, to build a brand new city for 500,000 people. And deep in the surrounding jungle, communities descended from headhunting tribes still live in longhouses stretching the length of a football field, following traditions that predate the nations, now governing the land around them entirely. This is Borneo, and it might be the wildest, least understood island most people have never actually heard of. Picture a rainforest so ancient that its oldest trees were already standing when the continents themselves looked nothing like they do today. A forest that predates the Amazon by tens of millions of years, and still shelters species found absolutely nowhere else on the planet. Picture an island split awkwardly between 3 separate nations, each governing its own slice of some of the most biodiverse jungle left on Earth. And picture a government right now, in real time, bulldozing a path directly through that same ancient forest to build an entirely new national capital from scratch. How does an island this wild, this old, and this biologically irreplaceable end up at the center of a project this disruptive? Let's find out. Borneo is the 3rd largest island in the entire world, a landmass so vast it sprawls across roughly 740,000 square kilometers, an area larger than France, straddling the equator in the heart of Southeast Asia. Politically, the island is divided among 3 separate countries, a division that reflects colonial-era boundary lines drawn with little regard for the ecosystems or communities living across them. The majority of the island, known as Kalimantan, belongs to Indonesia, comprising roughly 73% of Borneo's total land area, while the northern coastal regions of Sabah and Sarawak belong to Malaysia. And the small, oil-wealthy nation of Brunei occupies a modest coastal enclave squeezed between them, its relatively tiny footprint concealing outsized wealth built almost entirely on offshore petroleum reserves discovered in the early 20th century. That fragmented political map sits awkwardly on top of a landscape that, ecologically speaking, has never recognized any of those borders at all. Rivers, mountain ranges, and unbroken stretches of forest flowing directly across national lines, as though the boundaries themselves didn't exist. An orangutan, or a river system paying no attention whatsoever, to which government technically claims the ground beneath it. Roughly 17 million people call the island home altogether, a population that includes an estimated 2 million indigenous Dayak people alongside coastal Malay communities, many of whom began converting to Islam centuries ago, and a growing number of migrants drawn to the island's cities, plantations, and, increasingly, its newest and most ambitious construction project. What makes Borneo's rainforest so genuinely extraordinary isn't simply its size, but its age. Scientists estimate the island's forests have existed in some form for roughly 130 to 140 million years, making them among the oldest continuously existing rainforests anywhere on Earth, older than the Amazon, older than most of the flowering plant species that now dominate forests across the rest of the planet, old enough that the massive dipterocarp trees, which dominate Borneo's lowland canopy today, descend from lineages that were already ecologically established, while dinosaurs still roamed much of the rest of the world. That staggering age has given Borneo's ecosystem an almost unmatched amount of time to diversify, producing a level of biodiversity that genuinely rivals anywhere else in the world. An estimated 15,000 plant species, more than 1,400 species of amphibians, birds, fish, mammals, and reptiles combined, and an unknown, likely still uncounted number of insect species. New discoveries turning up regularly enough that biologists consider Borneo one of the last great frontiers for cataloging entirely new forms of life on land. Despite covering only a tiny fraction of the Earth's total land surface, Borneo's forests are believed to hold roughly 10% of the world's plant species, 16% of its reptiles and amphibians, 17% of its bird species, and 12% of its mammal species. A concentration of life so dense that a single hectare of Bornean rainforest can sometimes contain more tree species than exist across the entirety of North America. The island's most famous residents are its orangutans, the only great apes found anywhere outside continental Africa, arboreal, remarkably intelligent primates that spend the vast majority of their lives moving through the forest canopy rather than on the ground, building a fresh sleeping nest out of woven branches almost every single night, a behavior so consistent that researchers can sometimes estimate local orangutan population density simply by counting abandoned nests scattered through the forest. Borneo's rainforest also shelters pygmy elephants found nowhere else on the planet, a genuinely distinct population noticeably smaller and, by most accounts, gentler in temperament than mainland Asian elephants. Clouded leopards perfectly adapted to hunting through dense canopy with teeth proportionally longer relative to their skull size than any other living cat. and the proboscis monkey, an animal so strange-looking, with its oversized nose and distended belly built to house a specialized digestive system for breaking down toxic leaves, that early European sailors reportedly nicknamed it after their own long-nosed countrymen back home. Indonesian Borneo alone is now believed to hold close to 3/4 of the world's remaining wild orangutan population, making the fate of this single island genuinely inseparable from the survival of the entire species. A responsibility that weighs heavily on conservationists watching habitat loss continue even as awareness of the crisis has grown considerably over the past few decades. Long before any of that biodiversity had a name assigned to it by outside science, Borneo's interior had already been home for thousands of years to the Dayak, an umbrella term covering dozens of distinct indigenous groups, including the Iban, Kayan, Kenya, and Penin, each with their own language, customs, and territory carved out across the island's dense interior. Traditional Dayak longhouses, enormous communal dwellings sometimes stretching hundreds of meters and housing an entire village under a single connected roof, remain one of the most immediately recognizable symbols of Borneo's indigenous culture. Generations of families living side by side along a shared covered veranda that functions as both private home and public gathering space at once. Individual family apartments opening directly onto that same communal corridor where children play. Elders' trade stories and major decisions affecting the entire longhouse community are debated openly among residents who have spent their entire lives as neighbors. Until roughly a century ago, some Dayak communities practiced headhunting, a ritual tradition tied closely to warfare, spiritual belief, and social status that outside colonial administrations worked deliberately and often forcibly to suppress a practice. Long since abandoned, but still central enough to Borneo's popular reputation that the phrase "wild men of Borneo" followed the island's indigenous population for generations in outside accounts, often reducing genuinely sophisticated, deeply rooted societies with their own complex systems of law, agriculture, and craftsmanship to a single sensationalized stereotype that outsiders found easier to sell in travel writing than the far more nuanced reality. Not every Dayak community settled into permanent villages at all. The Penin people of Sarawak remain among the last genuinely nomadic hunter-gatherer communities left anywhere in Southeast Asia, traditionally moving through the forest in small family groups, relying entirely on hunting, foraging, and an intimate, generations-deep knowledge of the surrounding jungle rather than fixed agriculture, their traditional territory understood not through maps or fences, but through an oral memory of specific trees, streams, and hunting grounds passed down across countless generations. As commercial logging expanded aggressively into their traditional territory beginning in the latter half of the 20th century, the Penin became some of the most visible and determined defenders of Borneo's remaining forest, organizing blockades against logging trucks and drawing international attention to a conflict that has since become emblematic of a much larger tension playing out across the island. Indigenous communities whose entire way of life depends on standing forest, up against powerful commercial interests whose profits depend on cutting it down, a struggle Penin activists have carried at real personal risk into international courtrooms and advocacy campaigns for decades. Rivers have always functioned as Borneo's true highways, since the island's dense interior forest and rugged mountainous terrain made overland travel genuinely difficult across most of its history. Major waterways like the Kapuas and the Mahakam Wind for hundreds of kilometers through the island's interior, still serving today as essential transportation corridors connecting remote upriver villages to coastal towns and cities. Longboats and river ferries carrying passengers and cargo along routes that, in many areas, remain considerably more reliable than any road. Entire riverside communities built with their front doors facing the water rather than any street, since the water has always been the street. Along the island's northern edge, Mount Kinabalu rises to just over 4,000 meters, the highest peak anywhere between the Himalayas and New Guinea, its dramatic granite summit drawing climbers from around the world and hosting plant species found nowhere else, including carnivorous pitcher plants large enough to trap small mammals. While deep within Sarawak's interior, the vast cave systems of Gunung Mulu National Park include a single underground chamber believed to be the largest known cave chamber by measured area anywhere on Earth. A cavern so enormous it could reportedly house several jumbo jets parked comfortably side by side, its ceiling home to millions of bats that pour out each evening in a single dense, swirling column visible from a considerable distance away. That extraordinary natural wealth has come under sustained serious pressure over the past half-century. Once almost entirely blanketed in dense tropical rainforest, Borneo has lost more than half its total forest cover since the 1970s, driven overwhelmingly by industrial logging and the explosive global expansion of palm oil plantations. On a commodity found in everything from packaged food to cosmetics to biofuel, and one for which Borneo's climate and soil happen to be almost perfectly suited for large-scale, highly profitable cultivation. Vast stretches of what was once continuous, Ancient rainforests have been cleared and replaced with monoculture palm plantations, rows of identical trees stretching to the horizon in places that, within living memory, held some of the densest, most species-rich forest anywhere on the planet, fragmenting orangutan habitat into isolated pockets, increasingly too small to sustain healthy, genetically diverse populations over the long term, and pushing conservation organizations into an urgent, ongoing effort to protect and reconnect whatever intact forest still remains before it disappears entirely. Coal mining and other extractive industries have compounded that pressure further in parts of Kalimantan, carving open pits into forest and grassland alike, and illegal logging continues in some areas despite official protections, driven by demand for valuable tropical hardwoods that remain profitable enough to make enforcement genuinely difficult across such a vast, remote, and often poorly monitored landscape. Into that already fragile landscape, Indonesia has now introduced an entirely new and genuinely enormous source of pressure. In 2019, the Indonesian government announced plans to relocate the country's capital away from Jakarta, a metropolis of some 30 million people struggling under severe flooding, catastrophic traffic congestion, and a genuinely alarming rate of land subsidence that has left large portions of the city sinking below sea level by as much as 15 centimeters a year. Roughly 40% of Jakarta now sitting below sea level entirely as excessive groundwater extraction continues literally pulling the ground out from beneath it. The replacement, a brand new planned city called Nusantara, an old Javanese term meaning archipelago, is being built from scratch in East Kalimantan, directly within Borneo's own forested interior, roughly 30 kilometers inland from the Makassar Strait, construction beginning in earnest in 2022 and continuing rapidly ever since, roads and government buildings now carved into land that, just a few years earlier, had been unbroken forest and oil palm plantation. Officials describe Nusantara as a green, forest-integrated smart city, designed to run on renewable energy and eventually house an initial population of 500,000 people, complete with plans for a presidential palace positioned deliberately at what officials describe as the symbolic geographic center of the entire Indonesian archipelago. But scientists and indigenous communities working in the surrounding region have raised serious concerns about the project's real environmental cost, racing in recent months to document the sounds and ecological patterns of forest that construction is actively transforming, in some cases permanently, before that particular stretch of ancient Bornean jungle disappears for good. Researchers working alongside local Dayak communities specifically to preserve generations of accumulated ecological knowledge about a landscape now being reshaped faster than at almost any point in its long history. Amid all of that pressure, genuine reasons for cautious optimism have also emerged. Conservation groups working directly with Dayak communities have helped establish protected forest areas covering hundreds of thousands of hectares in recent years. Partnerships built specifically around the recognition that long-term forest protection works best when it's managed jointly with the indigenous communities who have lived within and depended on that same forest for generations, rather than imposed entirely from outside. In East Kalimantan's Wehia landscape, for instance, the Dayak Wehia community has worked directly with conservation organizations to secure a protected area covering close to 30,000 hectares, alongside sustainable management agreements covering more than 500,000 additional hectares of surrounding forest, creating exactly the kind of large, connected habitat that orangutan populations need to remain genuinely viable over the long term rather than isolated into shrinking, disconnected pockets. Community-led conservation efforts across other parts of East Kalimantan have similarly helped secure crucial habitat corridors linking previously fragmented forest, evidence that Borneo's forests, and the animals and communities depending on them, still have a genuine, if far from guaranteed, path forward, provided that kind of community-based protection can keep pace with the competing pressures of logging, plantation expansion, and now an entirely new capital city rising directly in the middle of it all. What makes Borneo's story so remarkable and so precarious all at once is the sheer scale of what's actually at stake here. A rainforest, old enough to have witnessed the entire rise and fall of the dinosaurs, home to roughly 3/4 of the world's remaining wild orangutans. Indigenous communities whose knowledge of this specific landscape stretches back thousands of years and whose longhouses and river villages remain living, functioning communities